Ladies and gentlemen, we have here a fine specimen for sale, as per the law of Willow Bend.
They offered her for half the cost, but nobody had the guts to make a bid until a solitary ranch hand lifted his arm. When the locals huddled around the elevated stand in Willow Bend, not a soul uttered a word bold enough for it to bounce back, as if the burden of the impending event had clamped down on every larynx all at once. And right in the heart of that strained throng stood Alara, hands tied, head angled just a touch to conceal the whirlwind of terror and rebellion clashing deep in her gaze, the edges of her leather attire fluttering faintly whenever she adjusted her stance, striving to cling to some shred of poise, even though she realized the fellows leering at her viewed her as nothing more than a commodity up for barter. Sheriff Harlan, the fellow overseeing the sale, advanced and declared in a timbre laced with command, honed from seasons of ordering bandits to heel, that she was up for grabs at reduced rate, owing to the village board's urgency and the strain from the district enforcers due in just a handful of days, stirring low rumbles from the assembled drovers and traders who swapped looks but wouldn't lift so much as a finger. For while they regarded her with a blend of intrigue and a shadowier hunger, none of them had the nerve to defy the rugged band of mercenaries idling over yonder on the avenue, the true culprits behind why Alara was planted there to begin with. A savage outfit dubbed the Blackthorn Gang, who insisted she'd invaded their outpost and swiped him out, though a glance at her now revealed the charge rang false against her essence. But the gang wielded clout, and clout warped facts into any form it desired, and the locals dreaded them far too fiercely to meddle. Alara's breathing hastened as the sheriff attempted once more, his tone firmer now, pressing that somebody advance and claim her or he'd be compelled to return her to the gang. And with that, a wave of unease rippled across the spectators, because every soul in Willow Bend grasped precisely what falling back into that crew's clutches spelled for anybody. Yet still, nobody budged, the hush dragging on so endlessly that even the ponies tethered close by pawed the ground uneasily, until abruptly from the rear of the assembly, a lone ranch hand shouldered his way forward with the even stride of someone who moved only after he'd tallied every fallout and embraced them all. His name was Jackson Hale, a spread owner who mostly kept to his lonesome, a fellow whose standing rested not on bluster, but on a subdued, ironclad grit that often gave pause to perilous sorts before they crossed him. And as he neared the dais, the gathering split apart on reflex, as if some gut sense whispered this instant wouldn't unfold like the rest. Alara raised her sightline just a fraction to catch him entering the glow, his Stetson tipped low, his stare fixed on her with an element she hadn't glimpsed from any other gent there. Acknowledgement, not the kind of familiarity from prior acquaintance, but the sort that beheld her as a person and not wares. And when he at last halted at the platform's edge and hoisted his hand, the whole circle went stock still, as though the clock itself paused to exhale, because nobody had foreseen a soul contesting the gang's assertion, least of all a lone figure. The sheriff wavered, flicking a peek toward the Blackthorn Gang, who scowled in return with palms inching perilously near their sidearms, but he reckoned too that the code shielded any rightful purchaser. And Jackson's timber emerged soft yet steadfast as he affirmed he'd assume charge of her, not as chattel, but as one unjustly harmed and worthy of equity. And even as the sheriff discreetly motioned for restraint, he didn't balk at the bid. Instead, he slammed his palm on the timber beam to seal the handover beneath the thin veil of local ordinance, since the gang edged one pace nearer in defiance before freezing when Jackson's fingers settled at his hip where his six-shooter nestled in its hide scabbard. The barest adjustment in his bearing, signaling to every battle-hardened glance that he'd unholster if pressed and wouldn't falter. The gang's chief hawked into the soil, vowing this wasn't over, that they'd return to seize what they reckoned was theirs. But for now, they withdrew, their menace hanging in the gritty breeze like a hex. Jackson ascended the risers, his motions measured and intent as he drew close to Alara, who remained stiff, uncertain if he spelled yet another peril, or the initial spark of clemency she'd glimpsed since they'd hauled her into the settlement. And he murmured to her gently that he wasn't there to possess her, only to shield her from the brutes who dragged her hence. And though she held her tongue, her eyes danced with a swirl of bewilderment and tentative optimism as he sliced the cord cinching her wrists. The assembly, at a loss for response, melted away gradually, murmuring among themselves about the storm Jackson had just courted, while Jackson extended Alara a flask of water and nodded softly toward his steed, not shoving her, merely lingering, granting her an option she hadn't savored in days. After a drawn-out beat, she dipped her chin ever so slightly, the tiniest yield to faith, and the pair ambled from the stand as the sunlight stretched elongated shades in their wake, neither quite grasping yet that this one uplifted arm had unleashed a clash poised to unearth concealed realities, unearth ancient scores, and kindle a showdown apt to reshape the sway of might in Willow Bend for good. Jackson guided Alara to the fringes of the village where his humble spread nestled beyond a bluff, but the track wasn't so much a serene withdrawal to haven as a brief lull in the tempest brewing astern. For Alara sensed the heft of the Blackthorn gang's warning shadowing them like a specter, and though she maintained her bearing erect, her mind swirled with doubt over why this unknown soul had wagered so dearly for her sake, while Jackson, ambling a hair in the lead, peered over his shoulder now and then, not from distrust of her, but to gauge if she managed the rhythm comfortably, since he noted from the taut fold of her limbs how the tether had rubbed her flesh sore. Once they arrived at the spread, he tendered her sustenance, refreshment, and a spot to rest, sans pressin' for accounts. And for a spell, she merely watched him through fatigued orbs, puzzling over his quietude, because she'd discovered the rough route that benevolence forever bore a toll. Yet Jackson navigated his compact abode with an ease of one who anticipated no payback. At length, she ventured words in a fractured lilt, recounting the verity the gang had mangled, that she hadn't pilfered a pony whatsoever, but had been snatched by them as she skirted their domain foraging for botanicals, nabbed since one figured she'd serve as prime bait for browbeating. And when she'd strived to flee, they'd concocted the charge to warrant holding her captive. And as she unfolded her tale, her fingers quivered, not solely from dread, but from the impotent fury of one muted overlong. Jackson hearkened without a peep, his mandible clenching a mite at the recount of the gang's designs for her, and he assured her he credited each syllable, because the gang had been extending their grip into adjoining hamlets, exploiting lax constables, and any soul too cowed to resist. And while the sheriff harbored good intent, he couldn't safeguard all without aid. Alara queried why he'd stepped in when nobody else had deigned to regard her as flesh and blood, and Jackson lingered before replying that ages back, the gang had claimed somebody dear to him as well, his kid brother, who'd striven to shield a homesteader they were shaking down, a lad brimming with pluck beyond prudence, and who'd forfeited his breath because the sediment had quaked too fiercely to bear witness. So when Jackson beheld her upon that podium, he knew Holden Mute would render him kin to the onlookers who'd let his sibling perish. Absorbing this didn't dispel Alara's unease, but it eased a knot inside her, an awareness that suffering can etch empathy in unforeseen corners. And though she kept it unspoken, she found herself leaning into trust more than she'd bargained. Meanwhile, back in Willow Bend, the gang was scheming their reprisal already, seething that one individual had spurned them openly, and they bragged to the tavern patrons that they'd gallop out ere first light to recapture their prize, kindling alarm that raced swift through the burg, since all knew the gang savored payback, draped in display. Deep into the evening, as Jackson perched honing his blade by lantern gleam, Alara neared, and confessed that she didn't wish to summon peril to his threshold, that she could bolt onward and endure solo if it spared him harm. But he wagged his head and stated flat out that fleeing wouldn't deter the gang, that they'd stalk her regardless of trail, and he wouldn't permit their savagery to scar yet another soul. So instead, he suggested a daring ploy. They'd venture back to Willow Bend and unmask the gang with proof he suspected lingered from bygone misdeeds, papers, affidavits that folks had shrunk from airing, but could lay bare the gang's ties to contraband paths.
Alara wavered, but the spark in Jackson's resolve echoed that liberty wasn't seized by skulking. So come morn, they spurred into the burg side by side, not as outlaws or detainees, but as two souls yoked by sundry griefs and a common thirst for redress. As foretold, the gang accosted them at once, strutting into the lane with grips on their irons, anticipating Jackson to yield. But rather, Alara advanced, hoisting her head in a manner that hushed even the sots in the tavern archway, and she indicted the gang squarely before the sheriff, the villagers, and the board convening for their routine huddle, her pitch even-keeled enough to slice the fraught haze. And what none anticipated was for locals to creep forth from panes and portals bit by bit, because witnessing her proclamation with such mettle stirred an ember in them, a weariness of dwelling in another's dread. One after another, a smattering of gents ventured up, divulging what they'd witnessed the gang's deeds over the prior 12-month, and Jackson wove in his brother's chronicle, prompting even the sheriff's grasp to quiver with ire. The gang lunged to yank their pistols to quash the revolt. But this go-round, rather than bolt, the villagers held fast alongside Jackson. And in the fleeting instant of doubt that ensued, the sheriff's aides shifted to flank, encircling the gang, who cottoned too tardily that the shield they'd relished had crumbled beneath the pooled valor of the very crowd they'd once lorded over. The gang got collared, their dominion peeled off in the blink of an eye that echoed the unburdening of epochs of subjugation, and once the grit cleared, the villagers turned to Alara with thanks over trepidation, honoring her daring not as a stray, but as one who'd aided in hauling them from their own hush. Jackson faced her and murmured she was unbound to pick her course ahead, be it lingering, rejoining her kin, or treading a fresh trail altogether. And though she tarried on a reply, she met his eyes with a tender, firm gaze that bore deeper verity than utterances might, a gaze vowing her tale was unbound now by bonds or fright, but by the fortitude she'd seized the instant a solitary ranch hand uplifted his arm and elected to align with her against a realm that had once sworn she braved it solo.
Friends, if you enjoyed this story, visit my YouTube channel for more interesting and emotional videos. The link is given in the description and in the bio. Just tap and explore more content like this. And yes, if you subscribe to the channel, it makes me truly happy and motivates me to create better stories for you every day. Your support means everything. If you want to help us grow even more, you can also send stars. Each star is a huge encouragement for our work. Thank you so much for watching and supporting.